Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest EP from Ihsahn Telemark. This is the first of two EPs that Ihsahn is set to drop this year, and considering I'm a pretty big fan of Ihsahn's solo work as well as his work with Emperor back in the day, I was pretty excited to hear this new project, considering I'm a pretty big fan. Overall, this is a pretty solid EP in my opinion. It sees Ihsahn continue to explore this sort of progressive black metal sound that I think he does rather nicely. The first three tracks on this thing are pretty consistent and solid all the way through. Each of these tracks has some pretty solid riffs to them. They all have this kind of melodic, sort of progressive sound to them at points with their instrumentation. However, when it comes to the vocal deliveries here on these tracks, they're pretty aggressive, pretty straightforward. It's a nice blend between a more straightforward black metal sound and some of those odder, more progressive tendencies that Ihsahn has explored in the past. I also feel like these three tracks have a pretty solid and consistent atmosphere to them as well. It's pretty cold, pretty natural sounding, and the way that these three tracks flow together is pretty solid as well. It just makes for a very cohesive experience. The EP probably hits its climax at its third track, the title track on this thing, which is not only the longest song here, but probably just the most expansive and interesting on this thing as well. It has a killer riff on it, my favorite riff on the entire project. The atmosphere on this track is just fantastic. The way that it progresses throughout its runtime is just incredibly interesting. There's not a dull moment on this track, even though it's the lengthiest one here. And while the two tracks that preceding it aren't necessarily that much weaker overall, I feel like the title track on this thing is just incredibly solid, one of my favorite metal cuts of the year so far. Overall, if you're familiar with Ihsahn's work and black metal music in general, the first three tracks on this thing I don't think will give you a ton of surprises necessarily, but it's still a very consistent, very enjoyable selection of tracks. However, following the third track on this EP, the EP decides to go in a very different direction than what it's been doing up to this point, with a couple of cover tracks that close this thing out. The covers here are pretty decent overall. I don't think they're bad, but they definitely change the pace of the EP to the point where it feels kind of jarring, honestly. It almost feels like I'm getting three tracks that were clearly meant to go together on some sort of original project, just kind of being mashed together with two random cover tracks, which do have some cohesion to them as well. It almost feels like two different projects are kind of being mashed together here on this EP. It's not the worst thing in the world because, like I said, the covers are still pretty decent overall, but I kind of wish that instead we maybe got a couple of original tracks that kept the vibe of the first three songs on this thing. Either that or even just getting the first three songs on this thing by themselves as the EP, I think would have made it just a bit more cohesive and to the point and not as odd when it comes to the track listing here. As for the couple of covers on this thing, when it comes to the tracks themselves, as I said before, they're pretty decent on their own, even if they do feel kind of out of place when compared to the original tracks on this thing. The first cover that you get here is a cover of the Lenny Kravitz song, Rock and Roll is Dead. Much of the composition of the original song remains intact here when it comes to things like the riffs. Really, it's a pretty big departure from the progressive black metal sound present on the first few songs here. It's really just this more straightforward kind of rock and roll black metal mixture, as Ihsahn does keep the harsh vocals here on this thing, and he also incorporates some jazzier elements such as horns into the instrumentation too, which is pretty unique as well. But even still, it's a pretty straightforward cover for the most part outside of those things, and it's pretty decent, pretty fun, pretty enjoyable, and pretty catchy too. But yeah, it just kind of feel a little bit out of place after the song that precedes it. The second cover that you get on this thing is a cover of Iron Maiden's Wrathchild. Once again, the cover here is pretty straightforward and to the point. The only major difference really being that, again, the vocals are harsher, and you do have, again, some horns coming into the mix as well, making things sound a bit jazzier at times in a sort of odd, creative way that I kind of like. But even still, it's a pretty straightforward cover. I do like the original track, and I do still like the cover here as well for much of the same reasons, but I do still, at the end of the day, feel like the two covers that come at the end of this thing, while enjoyable, they're not quite up to the same level of quality as the first three songs on this EP. Again, they're still solid, they're still catchy and fun, but they feel like they belong on a different project almost. And I would maybe be interested in listening to that cover project if it existed in full, but in the context of this EP, it's a little bit odd. Again, fine tracks, but yeah, they're just kind of there for the most part. But all things considered, I think that Telemark is a pretty solid EP. through and through. It does have some faults, most notably with the track listing here and how the EP seems to have almost two separate personalities to it at times, but the actual tracks that you end up getting here on this project are really enjoyable. The first three tracks here have a nice progressive black metal sound to them, lots of great riffs, lots of great performances, nice vocal deliveries here as well. The atmosphere on these three tracks is fantastic too, and the way that they all flow together is just excellently done. And while the two covers at the end of this thing aren't necessarily mind-blowing or anything, they are fun, they are catchy, and Ihsahn sounds like he's having a good time performing these tracks. And while they don't necessarily fit with the first three songs, they're decent in their own right. So if you're a fan of Ihsahn, if you're a fan of his kind of music that he makes, I think you'll certainly get some enjoyment out of this EP. Certainly give it a listen, and I'm certainly excited to see what the second EP he's going to drop this year is going to be like, given the quality of this one here. So overall, this is a very solid EP. Definitely give it a listen if you like metal. But that's just my own thoughts on this project. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this EP in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.